thank you so much for coming on. You sent me quite an extensive backstory, which was a bit of a wild ride. Could you just give us a little bit of background on your very beginnings? I think it was like 7 siblings, was it?
Yeah, I think why people do what they do is often a result of a backstory. Without going into great detail, I'm now a senior academic, but I didn't come up in an academic family. I never started out that way. I grew up the eldest 8 children on a farm and left school without a matriculation in the beginning. So I didn't even have a high school certificate. And today I have 3 degrees and work as an academic. So it is a heck of a ride to get to where I am.
So you came out of rural life into the army, is that correct?
Yes, I grew up, as I said, eldest of 8 on a farm. That was in the 60s. And the farm needed me to help out as an eldest son. But in the 60s, things were not too good in rural Australia and there was not a living there. So I had to look around to do something else. And army came along in the early 70s. So I ended up spending 5 years in the army and then eventually leaving the army back out into a professional field.
So what was the desire to leave rural life if you were needed there? Why did you join the army?
Money.
Money.
Basically, in the 1960s, rural Australia was in serious decline. The wool boom had ended. The wheat market was falling apart. There was a period of long recession in the rural sector. And I had 6 sisters and a brother all going through boarding school. There literally wasn't a future for young men. And in fact, in that period, thousands of young men left and women left the land to come to city jobs.
And you began studying journalism while you were in the army?
I'd started studying journalism while I was still on the farm, part-time, because when I realized that I needed to find a profession of some kind away from agriculture, hadn't finished my studies in a diploma in journalism, and then I managed to both get a matriculation and finish that diploma course and enroll in a Bachelor of Arts while I was in the army.
And did you just see that as basically a method towards more money, or was journalism actually a personal interest?
No, that's a good question. Writing was always in my blood or in my brain, because even at school, I started a literary magazine when I was about 9, 10 years old at school. So I was always interested in writing. I excelled in English. And by the time I'd left school, I'd actually published short stories and poetry. Now, there's not a living in short stories and poetry, but journalism is where you can get a job. And so my love of writing translated to journalism.
And what do you think attracted you to that writing? Was it just you didn't have many methods of self-expression at the time, or?
I think it's more than self-expression, because I also learnt music and played music. I dabbled in art. So I was interested in self-expression, but writing, whether it's professional writing of books or journalism, I guess I was always a critical thinker. And when you're a critical thinker, you think about things and you think things could be better. And you come up with ideas, or you want to interview and talk to other people with ideas, and you want to give those ideas wings. And one of the ways to give ideas wings in our world is writing about it.
So what kind of ideas at the time were you playing around with in your short stories and poetry?
As a teenager, of course, you're interested in identity and music and those kind of things. So initially I started writing about, the issues of the 60s and 70s, which was more about self-identity, the new generation. There was a huge generational shift happening, as we all know, in the 60s. It was a period of massive change in music. I mean, my parents loathed the music that I listened to, for example. We went from Doris Day to Procol Harum in the matter of a couple of years, and so forth. So it was that. But as I evolved and matured, I became very interested in politics, not politics in political parties, but politics in terms of democracy, people's rights, human rights, and so on. And that's something I have pursued till the current day.
So would you say at the time your goal in writing was basically communicating these ideas and sharing them with others?
Yeah, I think anyone who's an artist of any kind, writer or a poet or a singer, you want to say something, and it may be your own ideas, or it may be ideas you see that you respect, that you want to give voice to. So it's not always your own ideas. As a journalist, very often it was interviewing other people whose voice was important, but you can get that voice out into the public domain. So I suppose I always wanted to, communication. And from those very early days in studying journalism to today as a professor of public communication, I've always been in communication in one form or another.
Okay. Well, was that coming out of the army? Was it just because you had basically completed study, or were you becoming more engaged with that idea of communication?
I went into the army. Really, it was a very rational thing at the time because I sat at home on my family's farm and worked out what I wanted to do. And I went through a list of literally all the occupations that I could think of. And of course, I couldn't be a lawyer or a pilot because I didn't have the qualifications. I went through Army, Navy, Air Force, all the services, and I didn't particularly want to go to sea, and I couldn't fly. So I came up with the Army because, they paid you, they gave you clothes, they gave you board. There was a risk at the time. The Vietnam War was still on. But the Army also promised you could do education. So I joined the Army not as a career soldier, not thinking that my lifelong career was in the military, but for the opportunity, the quid pro quo, that if I gave service to the Army, they would give service to me through education and training. The education and training was fantastic in the Army. And so I thought I'd do 3 years. I ended up doing 5 years because in the latter 2 years, because I'd studied journalism, the Army offered me a role in Army public information. And so I finished up working with camera crews and writing scripts and making films in my after military training in the Army. And then from that led to going back out into a full-time journalism job.
Okay. And was that initially entering into that job, was that an easy process, or was there a bit of a steep climb?
I don't think getting any job in any generation is an easy process. It's not easy for young people today. It was actually particularly hard for me because I'd left school at year 10 because our family farm was in real trouble. And at one stage, my father thought we're going to lose the farm and the bank was going to take it. And that would have been a disaster. So I really lacked education. And so I had to work full time. I've never studied full time since I left school. So I studied part time, and I was underqualified initially, but progressively you work on your qualifications. And I've done that. I think I've now done 18 years of part-time university study.
And you really kicked it off starting a agency. Am I right?
Yes, I worked as a journalist for 7 or 8 years, and as often happens with journalists get recruited into political press secretary roles. I was recruited to run some election campaigns, and then the company that was doing that, the consultancy, offered me a job as a consultant in their public relations firm. And then in 1985, I decided I'd form my own company, and IT was really taking off in the early 80s. And so I set up a company called Macro Communication that specialized in promoting IT, and ended up working for Compaq and Lotus and Microsoft and a whole range, Vodafone, a whole range of IT companies. And that company was very successful. So,
well, can you speak a little bit to how that business is kind of perceived, like from outside of communications? Most like public relations, running campaigns, and that kind of thing is seen as one of the slimiest professions on the face of the earth, I would say, which I personally do not believe in. But can you just speak to a little bit about how it is running that?
Working in and around marketing and public relations in those fields, there is certainly an element of it that is, you use the word slimy. It's not got a great reputation. That's not the total field. And if we didn't have marketing and promotion, we wouldn't know what to buy. You wouldn't have any goods in your house, etc. So there's a lot of very important work done. But I did progressively, having worked in that field, come to see the bad side of it, which eventually led me to leaving the consultancy side and going into research because I wanted to study and more critically. And I went into a commercial research company studying media. And then from there, that led to an academic role studying communication, where we certainly study it from a critical perspective as well as from a professional and practical perspective.
So seeing that bad side, your position in that profession, what were you trying to achieve within that profession, and why did the bad side conflict with that?
I was in that field, and I must say I enjoyed a lot of work in that field. I mean, we did communication campaigns for Australian Consumers Association, for CSIRO, and promoting science. We also, one of the jobs I did was launch Vodafone in Australia, and that's a commercial marketing job. But at the time, Telstra was a monopoly. Competition wasn't particularly good. Services weren't good. Telstra was still promoting an old analog network, and we came along with Vodafone, and they said, we're going to go digital. So we enjoyed that campaign. We had to educate the public on what GSM digital telephony was, and launch a competitive network. It was hard going. It was tough against a big monopoly. But to me, that's an example of consumer benefit by good ethical marketing. We could have launched an analog network more cheaply, but they launched a digital network from day one. So there was good work, but around, and in my company, I'd like to think we were highly ethical. We only chose companies that were doing good work. We never worked for tobacco companies, alcohol companies, and I didn't work for political parties. But there's still a lot of work in the area that's you could criticize from a number of reasons. There's problems with ethics in some agencies and some companies. There's problems in companies that don't listen to their customers and listen to consumers, very top-down. Governments don't listen to people adequately, which is something I study to this day. And so gradually, as you mature, and bearing in mind along the way, I'd finished my bachelor's degree, but I did a master's degree in research while I was working as a professional. I did a PhD while I was in industry. I had it before I came to the university. So I guess I got to a point where I was highly educated with a bachelor's, a master's, a graduate diploma, and a PhD working in professional practice. And that took me internationally. I worked around the world. And that eventually led to setting up a full-time research company, which I built up and sold. And that led to an academic appointment.
Because it seems like you have quite a almost blue-collar view of your work in that field. What was it that you were hoping to achieve?
You want to stop that?
Yeah, of course.
When you say blue collar, how do you?
It seems like you're just like out there, quote unquote, doing good work, which is like almost like every man, but it's like in such a different field to what that normal every man might be working in. And maybe that's from your experience in the farm. But what was it that you were hoping to achieve in that work? Because it is, although it is, you describe it in quite a labor way, I guess. I guess you're doing a lot more than what that might insinuate.
I guess I've always believed in the importance of communication. And I've studied sociology and things since, and some of the famous sayings, James Carey, a famous American scholar, said, communication is society. You can't have a society without communication. People individually have got to talk. We've got to have talk and communication between organizations and so forth. So to me, that's the underlying theme. It was always the importance of communication. Now, communication is important in commercial marketing. We need to find out about products and services. It should be done ethically. Communication is important in politics and policy making. Communication is important in daily life. So I was always driven by that. And when you say, that I had I guess you mean I had a practical focus. Yeah, I worked as a practitioner for many, many years. And that eventually led to an academic role. I tend to not support academics who've only ever worked in academia because they come at everything from a theoretical perspective and they have never really done it. And something I'm quite proud of and something that's led to my success in recent years is when I stand on stage at academic conferences, I can talk about the latest theory, but I've done it. And I've done it over 30, 40, 35 years. And so to me, that's probably part of my success today, that I can talk the talk and walk the talk.
I mean, I come from archaeology, and I massively agree with there's a very distinct difference between those who have actually worked in the field and those who
Absolutely.
haven't.
And I didn't just work in the field a little bit. I say I had 10 years in journalism, basically three lots: 10 years in journalism, 10 years in marketing and PR practice, and 10 years in commercial audience research. And that gives you really, really good perspectives. And now I've been 15 years as an academic.
So what is it now that you are hoping to achieve in your academic role?
A number of things in my academic work now, at an internal university perspective, because I'm a senior academic now, as a distinguished professor, some of my work is mentoring and helping others, giving others a leg up, supervising staff. But in my own research, I've really got two main areas that have evolved over my career. And one of them is evaluation of communication. So much public communication is wasted, fails. If you look at how governments communicate, you look at a lot of advertising campaigns, even some of the COVID campaigns. I still do research that shows that there's whole groups of the community that just don't get reached out to, don't get engaged. So I'm passionate about evaluation, that if you do evaluation, you find out when communication's failing and you find out what people need. And that linked to my second area of research, which is organizational listening. What I found in evaluation is the reason a lot of things fail in society is governments and corporations aren't listening to people. It's chronic. And I've now written books on the subject, and listening is a key part of communication. When we say communication, most people think about talking. And actually listening should be 50% of it. And it doesn't happen. And at the moment in society, where my passion and drive today comes from, is you look at trust. Trust is extremely low in governments and in corporations and even in the media. Why? They're not listening to anybody. They are still doing things the way they'd like to do things. And society is changing. People are concerned about the climate. People are concerned about diversity and gender issues and a whole lot of other things. And some politicians and policymakers are making an effort, but there's not enough yet. And look at climate change. Is it moving well enough? No. We've known about these problems for 3 decades, and we still, have politicians arguing with each other and playing politics. So it all comes back to communication. That I like to evaluate campaigns. I like to drive two-way communications that are listening as well as talking, which I believe are vital to society if we're going to improve society.
Oh, I totally agree. And at the core of that, that's such a great perspective that the listening is not adequate. At the core of that, do you think it is that political back and forth that neither of them really want to give in to the other on anything?
Well, there's a couple of things that happen. Certainly, probably the worst area is the political area, because politicians play party politics. And that's the area where you see whatever one party does, the other party will do the opposite, rather than sit back and say what's good for society. So many people are tired of party politics. We're seeing that going on at the moment with The Voice, for example. The other thing is, though, a lot of listening should occur in the public service and in corporations. And I've studied now for the last 7 or 8 years on why that often doesn't occur. And that often just doesn't occur because of systems and processes. They employ customer relations, but customer relations is not really customer relations. It's just there to help sell more products and pacify people who are unhappy, rather than be real, true customer. And I've worked with companies that replace that traditional form of customer relations with real listening. And they actually increased their business like 25, 30%, because they really found that listening to customers would help. And so there's both the politics of it, but there's also the breakdown of just systems. Organizations don't have to listen to 1 or 2 people the way we do as individuals. Organizations have got to listen to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. How do they do that? And so the sort of work I'm doing is with machine learning text analysis, analyzing complaints, and online tracking, and a lot of those tools, so organizations can actually listen. So it is the systems on one side that are out of date, and it's the party politics as well.
Well, that actual processes for listening better, that AI is that how are you using AI to do so?
Well, AI, of course, artificial intelligence has been around a long time. What's being talked about at the moment is more about generative AI, which is another whole leap forward. But if you look at algorithms, we've been using algorithms for years, and the way we analyze text at the moment is machine learning tools. Because I'll just give a quick example. In the UK, when I was studying government listening a few years back, there was a public consultation on health by the NHS, National Health Service, and they got 127,400 submissions, over 1 million pages if you printed it out. Now, no human can read and understand that. So what do? Nothing. They didn't have any software, any tools, or any skills. So I brought researchers in, and we actually did machine learning text analysis, and we're able to identify 7 major themes that were really important themes. Animosity towards the EU was one of them. And lo and behold, that was months before the Brexit vote. So we could have predicted the Brexit vote had they done that research, except I was doing it after the event. And so there's a simple example where you have to have those sort of technologies. And certainly AI is one. And call centers, millions and millions of people every day call centers, and it's all digitally recorded. But what do they do with all those digital recordings? Now, we can take that voice-to-text VTT software, scrape it into text, analyze it, and you can immediately see what are the top 10 complaints. And if a company did that, they would then be able to address those top 10 complaints and fix it. But actually, people just call the call centers, and the same complaints come in every day, and often the management doesn't even know. Yeah, they just pacify each individual caller. So that's the sort of the cutting edge work at the moment, using AI to really listen to large scale voice of people, to understand it, and then be able to do something about it.
That is so cool.
But it's cool research. It's cool research.
Yeah. I guess that is kind of the advancement in technology is very correlative with, as you're saying, like that lack of trust and lack of listening that can also answer it. Do you see going forward, is that trending one way or the other?
I think with AI at the moment, we're right in the center of a big debate about it. Because if you step back from AI and just look at it really objectively, AI is just a set of tools. Now, a shovel is a tool. A pencil is a tool. You can use a shovel to kill someone, or you can use a shovel to dig a hole, or you can use a shovel to grow vegetables in a garden. So what I'm saying is it's what you do with the technology. So we've got to stop blaming technology. All technology has affordances and applications. And going back to things like artificial intelligence, we can use them to analyze and understand public opinion. We can use it to listen to people, or we can use it to manipulate people. And so that's where the debate between politicians and technologists and academics is at the moment, is that how do we sufficiently regulate AI that it's work for the public good, but at the same time not restrict innovation and freedom. So it is a big debate. But most technologies through history, have had that. Motor cars are a technology that cause deaths every day, and yet overall, and they're causing pollution. But at the same time, they've enabled incredible freedom for people and people to travel. And when people travel, they become more educated. And so there's always benefits and there's always downsides. And it's up to us as humans to thoughtfully manage those things.
Well, I guess going into that, how do you see that debate going? Because, I mean, as we're not exactly great at thoughtfully managing things.
It usually takes us a time, and there's 2 levels of it. There's the legal level, and the law normally takes several years to catch up. And that's always the case. So then it's the other level is the politics of it. How do we pass policies, and how do we guide businesses and industries? And there's also a lot of self-responsibility that people need to apply. There is a self-regulation thing in that when you see things happen like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where they took Facebook data and used people's personal data, the self-regulation comes in because they're starting to realize with an educated population, companies that do that and governments that do that find themselves in serious trouble. And in that case, Cambridge Analytica's gone. It no longer exists. Public relations firms that have misbehaved are also gone, out of existence, many of them. So there is that risk that if you value your reputation, there's a self-regulation drive to do good. But we're still floundering around working out what it can do and what it can't do. I mean, there's panic about generative AI, that it can write things. But what people forget is it's not that complex. Generative AI, I can search myself or you or a topic online, and all generative AI can do is locate already published material. It can't create something new. It can't write a poem. Or if it did, it'd only borrow words from somewhere else. So it searches what's published, and therefore, if there is reliable information published, generative AI will produce a fairly good essay or summary. But what if you search something like vaccination, where there's a huge amount of misinformation published, as well as good information? Generative AI produces a confusing mess of an article that's mixing up both, because generative AI can't work out, it simply counts the frequency of mentions, for example. That's how it calculates popularity. And so if there's popular misinformation, it'll count it in the same way. So that's how AI can be really dumb in many ways. So we've got to realize that AI can do certain things, and some things it's not particularly good at. Like universities panic about students using generative AI to write their essays. Well, you'd have to be a pretty stupid academic to only ask people to write historical information. We ask people to critically think, give their ideas, maybe design something new. Generative AI can't do that. So generative AI will be a very useful tool for harvesting and assembling existing knowledge. That's what it'll do, and it'll do it brilliantly. And it'll probably change things with Wikipedia and some of those other tools that we've used, albeit Wikipedia's still got an advantage and it has editors. Generative AI has no editors. So we know what happens when there's no editors. So I guess I'm just giving examples of how it can do some things really well, but it has a whole lot of limitations. And so all good carpenters, all good doctors know that there's certain tools do certain things, and you don't use the wrong tool for something that it's not good at.
Yeah, I think you made a great point in there about disinformation, and I understand that you worked with the WHO, specifically around COVID, was it? And how do you regulate what actually is misinformation in the modern day? Because I think increasingly it's almost becoming like the public sphere is almost becoming postmodern, in the sense that it's like there is no right answer anymore, but still governments are regulating what is deemed information and misinformation. How do you think, how do you see frameworks, how do you think frameworks should operate in deeming misinformation information?
Yeah, information, misinformation, and disinformation are very complex concepts. And again, like many things, there's balancing. So we have the right to free speech, for example, embedded in most of our societies. And so we know on one hand, we can't restrict free speech. People are entitled to say their views. We also know that people are entitled to give an opinion. And with information, there is often competing information. Disinformation is usually defined very differently to even misinformation, because misinformation just could be a misunderstanding or an accidental interpretation. Disinformation is mostly interpreted by UK governments and OECD and UN bodies as information that is intentionally distributed against available evidence. And so it may be scientific evidence, it may be worldwide opinion. And so with disinformation, there's a reasonable confidence that we can take action against it, because it is usually intentional, it usually is malintentional, designed to, but see, if you take something like vaccination, there are alternative views on vaccination. And so we've got to allow people to be able to say, I don't want to be vaccinated, I fear after effects. That's fine, that's okay. But when someone turns around and says vaccination causes a certain disease, and there's a body of scientific evidence says it doesn't, that's not much different to Donald Trump saying you should drink disinfectant, because we know that by science, we know that that can kill people. And so I think it's, again, respectful of freedom of speech, respectful of opinion, but making reasonable steps where there is a body of evidence. And if someone simply goes against that evidence, and particularly if it has bad intentions and bad impact on people, then, but yes, we've moved to a postmodern world, and we have to accept that there is a variance of opinion on many, many issues, as opposed to a modernist world where we had things rammed down our throat, some of which were quite right, but as we look back now, some of which were quite wrong. You know, a woman's place is in the home, the earth is flat. These were things that people once believed and found to be very, very untrue. And so, yes, it's treading carefully and being reasonable.
Well, what do you believe are the best communication strategies for having those kind of conversations? I know everybody in the world at this point has had conversations where there's no way either of you are convincing the other.
Yeah.
What do you think, especially coming from large bodies, the best communication strategy is?
Well, communication, funnily enough, is something we sort of grow up thinking it's easy, because from the moment a human is a few months old, we can start to speak and understand a lot. So communication sort of comes naturally, and because it comes naturally, people think it's easy. But actually, if you define communication properly, and that's not just talking, it's actually creating meaning and sharing meaning. That's where the word comes from, communis, common and sharing. So to do that, it's actually quite complex because people are diverse. They have different views, different intentions, different cultures and so forth. The sort of techniques, there are a whole range of techniques that scholars like me now advocate. One principle is you've got to accept diversity. So we now live in a world that says, I have to anticipate that there will be diverse views on many things. And so you try to communicate within an environment of respect. But another key principle that helps rationalize that is what we call deliberation. So many conversations and debates, and even our politics, people go into it with some people highly informed and some very little informed and some misinformed. And so deliberative communication is where you say to people, let's say we were going to debate something, you say to people, okay, in advance of the debate, there's some reading you should do. Maybe it's both sides, alternative views, but you've got to become informed, and then you can come to the table to communicate. And so a lot of public consultation now, we do deliberative techniques where to participate, you have to spend some time becoming informed. You then get a much better debate, because part of the problem is people often come to the table based on their own personal views that could be wrong, or their family's views, or something they heard in the pub, or they've never even thought about it before. And so deliberation is an example. And then with deliberative, we often say that communication is also an ongoing thing. Public diplomacy and diplomacy works this way, that you often have to accept that you're never going to get agreement. But what you say is, we're always going to stay in communication. We're going to keep talking because we'll find areas where we can agree to collaborate, work together. And sometimes accommodation is part of it, where we have to accommodate others. Consensus and agreement is not necessarily the outcome of communication. So those are key things: deliberation, becoming informed, accommodation, rather than just trying to force people into a singular view.
Well, I guess, especially in terms of misinformation, actually convincing people to be able to have those kind of conversations, find some common ground in reading, whatever it might be. I mean, even in The Voice now, the No campaign is quite literally based on encouraging people not to do research. Yeah. How do you convince those people that to come to the table, basically?
It's difficult in democratic politics because in the case of The Voice, everyone is entitled to a vote. And, if you wanted to be radical, you'd say one of the great weaknesses of democracy is that idiots can vote. People who are totally uninformed can't have a right to a vote, the same as somebody who's really paid careful attention. We accept that weakness of democracy for the overall benefits that it provides and the equity that it provides. But certainly outside of democratic politics, in many governments around the world, including local governments, and I've studied some of them, they will say we're going to have, like it could be a local council, we're going to have consultation with the public on the street or this park or whatever, but they can say to participate in the debate, you have to do these things. You have to come to certain meetings. You have to read it. If you don't, you're not in it. So you can exert some control where you can require people, if they want to participate, they have to invest. And it's a reasonable request for people. Some of the experiments are done. Some are in California, some are in Europe, and with the European Commission have worked really well. That, yes, it has excluded some people, but only excluded people who just simply would not make any investment. But it's brought to the table people who've really done some homework, and they're finding real progress. They're finding people not only sometimes agreeing, but sometimes coming up with ideas better than the original proposal. because we now respect lived experience as well as academic and theoretical knowledge. So whether it's building wind farms or changing an airport runway, the lived experience of people is a valuable contribution. So I think you can never control these things. Communication is not something you control, but you can manage it.
Okay, well, coming to the end here, the common theme amongst your story and a lot of what we've focused on is I think you generally just want to help people communicate better with each other. Is that correct? And is that just from a general sense of empathy? Is that just what you think you should be doing as a person in society?
So the answer is, to the focus of my work on communication, is yes. Communication to me is fundamental. Why do I focus on communication? In the true sense of the meaning of bringing people together, creating society and harmony. Even if harmony is not agreement, it could be tolerance and accommodation. It's ethically more important to do that, because without communication, you're excluding people, you're denying people rights. So it's ethically important. But at the other level, it's a bit it's theoretical and practical. It's practical because if we don't have communication in society, things don't work so well. Government doesn't work so well, local communities fall apart, people feel isolated, denied a voice. So I guess my passion comes from the fact that effective communication, both at an individual level, but also today, because we live in very highly organized societies, communication with organizations and between people and organization is fundamental. And it's fundamental, it's ethically what we should do, it's practically what we must do.
Well, that's a fantastic place to end on, and thank you so much